Hello, and welcome to the Vicars Watch Dibley,
the podcast where real priests talk about pop culture and what we've learned about faith, life and the church. We've watched Dibley, and now we're watching everything else. I'm Kate.
I'm Ross.
And I'm Ruthie, and today we are talking about the 2007 comedy Hot Fuzz. We discuss all things morality, what it means to have the greater good or to aspire to the greater good. And it all gets a little bit heavy, so you might want a cornetto for this one.
Well, a holy happy hello to you all.
Hello.
We're in our vicarages and you're listening in. We're ready and raring to talk about Hot Fuzz and the greater good.
The greater
but
good.
First, we have a few notices. Ross, I think you're going to start us off.
Hello, everybody. First off, I just want to say off the top that I've got the lurgy.
Same.
You got the lurgy too. It's from hanging out with all these kids at the start of term, going into school, and all snotty and gross. So if I'm a bit slow, that's what's going on.
I think I'll have the lurgy next week when I've been in to schools.
It's coming for you. It's coming for you, Kate.
Children are gross.
Says the mother. That's not my notice, though. That's just some context for the episode. But no, my notice is that last weekend we had the pet service at Salisbury Cathedral. The first in years. Gosh. I think they used to do it a long time ago. And I was invited to preach at it and to be involved in the blessing of each animal that was there. And it just
what animals did you have?
We had mostly dogs, to be fair.
Yeah.
But I did bless Mimi the tortoise, which was lovely.
That's nice.
If you see any of the press photos, you will see Mimi the tortoise. She got a lot of photos taken. But it was great fun, and it made me think of Vicars Dibley because it was the pet service that meant that she had been properly accepted into the village at the end of the first season.
Yeah.
And it's such an epic episode that makes me cry at the climax of it. It's so cool. So
you and Kate too.
Yeah.
Both weep at that.
So here's for Geraldine and here's for all the pets.
I also have a snapshot of parish life. Related to Dibley, I was invited by one of the local WI groups to come and speak to them. For those of you who don't know what the WI is, it's the Women's Institute, and traditionally it's a bunch of ladies and there's lots of cake baking and crafts.
Jam and Jerusalem.
And they invite people to come and talk. So I was invited to come and talk, and they really wanted to hear about when I met Dawn French. So I had 45 minutes to talk about, though. So I gave them a bit of sort of how my vocational journey, that is my journey to ordination, was shaped by the Vicar of Dibley. Then meeting Dawn French, I played them a bit of a podcast and finished with the question, is being a vicar like being on the Vicar of Dibley? So,
and the answer is?
And the answer is yes and no. As if you've listened to the podcast, you will know. But I also judged a cress head competition that they had put together. That is planted cress in decorated eggshells, which is classic vicaring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which episode did you play a clip of?
The interview with Dawn.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
But
Sense.
I had a few people ask about how to listen to the podcast. I did have to explain what a podcast was to some of them. Traditionally, the membership of the WI currently is those of us in their silver years.
Yeah. Well, hello to all our new WI
yes,
listeners.
hello to our new lovely WI listeners.
You are welcome here. If it
Absolutely.
helps, it's like when Frank had his own show on Dibley Radio.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting to some, not to others.
Uh,
Talking of local groups comprised of local people meeting in village halls, this week we watched Hot Fuzz. So Ruthie, do you want to tell us all about that?
Yeah, Hot Fuzz is a film from 2007 and it stars two people who are Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. And it's all about a big city copper who's part of the London Metropolitan Police. He's a police officer and he is too good at his job. So he gets sent to a rural village in order to stop everyone else looking quite so bad at their job. And the other day, it just happened to be on the telly when my father-in-law was over. So me and Nat and my father-in-law just sat and watched the end of it and just, I'd forgotten how good a movie it is and just how hilarious it is and bits of it that I just think are brilliant. And also thought it'd be a good one to talk about on the podcast. So we'll get on to the kind of why we've picked it in a bit. I just wanted to ask us all about Hot Fuzz. Oh, it's part of the Cornetto trilogy as well, which is a niche bit of a nerd thing in that there's 3 films, all which feature a scene with a cornetto, different flavour each time. This one's original, is that right?
Yeah,
Blue.
so the
Original
blue one.
Blue cornetto.
So it's a series of films written by Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg. And the other films in the trilogy are Shaun of the Dead and World's
Shaun
End.
of the Dead. Yeah. Shaun of the Dead, also excellent zombie kind of apocalypse movie. I'm not sure I've actually seen World's End, shockingly.
It's aliens.
That's
sort of
aliens and
sci-fi
robots,
spoof.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Grand.
they're each a spoof of a specific genre.
Yeah. This is the police one. So, had both of you seen Hot Fuzz before today?
Yes.
Well, not today, but for this. And tell me your favourite quote and favourite scene from this movie. Go on,
Okay.
Ross.
So
Okay.
this might need to be censored, but my favourite quote is, "If you want to be a big cop in a little village, I've done a model village."
Yes. Yes.
Also, I find myself saying a lot, "Murder, murder, murder," just because I find it. Also, so this is set in Gloucestershire, which isn't too far from where I am. So the accents are very similar.
Yeah. Do you know what? You have done the thing that nerds will nerd out of, which we always think the Star Wars quote is, "Luke, I'm your father." And it's, "No, I am your father."
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I've got it the wrong way around. And you've done the same with that quote, because I always say it that way because it makes more sense, but it's not. It is, "You want to be a big copper in a small town, dust off up the model village."
Ah,
Which
there we go.
doesn't make linguistically more, well, it sounds better saying down.
Yeah,
but
it
there you
does.
go.
There we go.
That's a very much a nerd thing.
Yeah.
I hope you appreciate that, Kate, because that's my favourite quote too. And favourite scene from it, Kate?
Oh, there's just so many. I really like the climax of the movie and the kind of the sinister people gathered around the table.
Yeah.
I don't think I have a single favourite scene. I just think it's all very, very good.
Yeah. Okay. How about you, Ross?
I mean, yeah, it's a stellar movie, and there's some really great YouTube videos about the cinematography, the way that it keeps referencing itself and other movies within that sort of cop genre.
Yeah.
So it's a stellar film on so many levels, as well as just being an excellent comedy buddy movie.
Yeah.
I've gone to it several times to cheer me up in the past. It's so good. I think favourite quotes, I immediately think of Olivia Colman's character. And again,
Yes.
not many of those are repeatable here. So yeah, she's brilliant in it.
Nothing better than a bit of girl on girl.
Well, that's the one I was thinking of. Absolutely. In terms of favourite scene, the first one that springs to mind is the one with the actress Anne Reid when she's murdered in the flower shop.
Oh yeah.
And then that leads into that chase scene. So that one springs immediately to mind. But I mean, I adore Anne Reid. I think she's fabulous. She is. She's in Last Tango in Halifax. She's the voice of Gwendolyn in Wallace and Gromit. She's a British icon.
She is.
Yeah. So yeah, that one springs to mind. But yeah, it's you know, when's your birthday? What year? Every year.
Yeah.
There's some just cracking lines.
Yeah.
And it's really British. There's
so
something
British.
proper British about it.
Or no luck catching them swans then. It's only one swan actually.
Yeah. And that comes back again. No luck catching them killers then. Actually.
Yeah.
And the chase scene chasing the shoplifter. And the jumping over the fences, which is a callback to Shaun of the Dead, where Shaun can't jump over the fences. And it's supposed to be like demonstrating how different the characters are.
But that's a recurring thing across the Cornetto trilogy as well. They have things that crop up in each movie.
Which is it's very clever, and things like the two characters turning to each other and talking about going to the pub at a climax. It's very, and there's things like they do it in all three movies, don't they? Where at the start they outline in an obscure way what the full plot of the movie is going to be. I didn't pay enough attention when I was watching this one to notice a scene when they did it, but it's very clever writing, and I've been a big fan of Simon Pegg and his little group ever since Spaced on Channel 4.
Yeah.
Did you ever watch Spaced?
I had a friend at university who had watched it and loved it. So I've seen some of the episodes.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of the actors who were in Spaced come back in Shaun of the Dead and indeed Hot Fuzz.
It's a particular group of kind of friends and colleagues who are really well respected, which is also why you end up with people like Bill Nighy and
he's in a few of them.
Martin Freeman.
Martin Freeman's
it's
in
why they're really well respected, which is why you end up with actors such as Bill Nighy and Martin Freeman in the bit roles, because they're so respected. And Steve Coogan as well.
Steve Coogan's in it right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning, they are three of the other coppers in London, and interestingly, they all increase in fame as they increase in rank at the time. So Martin Freeman had the least fame, and he brings in Steve Coogan, who then brings in Bill Nighy, who even then
Bill Bailey's in it.
Twice.
I love Bill Bailey. Such a great comedian.
It's a real who's who of British comedy and acting talent. It's
and you've got like also probably the most famous actor at the time, Timothy Dalton, who he played Bond, and I remember at the time that Hot Fuzz came out, it was a big deal that Timothy Dalton was playing this side character in this obscure sort of movie, this silly movie.
Are there any...
he plays the shop guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he does.
Yeah. Supermarket manager.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, supermarket manager, sorry, to give him his proper title. He has some excellent lines, doesn't he, where it's pretending he doesn't know anything about it, but is doing all these, arrest me, I'm the slasher.
Yeah,
he's slashing my prices and all this stuff.
He's taunting. He taunts throughout the movie, like when after the traffic collision, which kills the Amdramas. He comes up, he drives past saying, "Never was there a tale of more woe than that of Juliet and her Romeo." And then playing Fire after the house explosion as he drives past.
Yes.
Like, really blatantly taunting.
Yeah. So the kind of whole plot of this is that he's sent to this village and it seems like it's the nicest village in town. Everything's lovely. And then all these supposed accidents happen. And Sergeant Nicholas Angel, who is the main police guy in it, he is convinced that they're not accidents. It's so suspicious, the high rate of accidents in this place. And the more he's kind of seeing inconsistencies, and he kind of takes what's Nick Frost's actual character name in this?
Danny
kind of becomes his protege, who on the first night he's there, he arrests him for drink driving. It turns out he's his a fellow officer, and he has to bring in cake for recompense for the fact that he ended up having a night in the cell. And he takes Danny under his wing and tries to teach him, like, there's always something going on, you know, look at this guy, he's got his hood over his face. Why has he got a hood over his face? Because he's duck ugly. No, maybe he's suspicious and people don't want to see him. Don't want to see him because he's duck ugly. And all these things are happening, and then it eventually turns out that all these murders that happen in the village aren't accidents. They are, in fact, murders. And there is a group, is it the Neighbourhood Watch?
The Neighbourhood Watch Alliance,
do they have
yes.
Neighbourhood Watch Alliance that gather together in the castle with their sinister hoods like a proper cult, and they're doing everything for the greater good.
The greater good.
Exactly. Every time that's said, they repeat it.
And they ominously chant in Latin, Bonum Communite Communitatis, which means for the good of the community, I think. Which just adds some drama to it.
So it's all very sinister, and to spoil the end of the movie, Nicholas Angel goes away. He's very much kind of law-abiding, following the letter of the law, and but doesn't know how to deal with this situation. And then he eventually he comes back, being inspired by Danny and his love of cop movies like Bad Boys and Lethal Weapon and all this stuff that they've watched, and there's a massive shootout, which is just ridiculous. And everyone gets arrested. And, it all comes to a head on the day of the Village of the Year award.
Yes, including, and this is a question we need to ask, is there a vicar in this movie?
Yes.
He is a member of the Neighbourhood Watch Alliance, and at the final shootout, he whips some guns out from under his cassock, I believe.
Yeah.
Also,
He's
one of the murders.
heat.
In one of the murders, the church is the weapon.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's gory, isn't it?
And that's why you've got to make sure that your buildings are nice and safe for insurance reasons. So the building is used as a weapon. It is quite silly, gory deaths in a way that, I mean, the bit where, is it Frank Skinner?
Yeah.
Who's the
not Frank Skinner, but
guy?
Mr. Skinner. Frank Skinner's
Mr.
a comedian.
Skinner. Oh, yeah. Skinner gets the church steeple
The model
through his
church
chin.
steeple. Yeah. Oh,
Yes.
Oh.
That bit's grim and I don't like, but the rest are just kind of, that's obviously gross and not real in the same way.
There is a departure from reality from the moment. Well, really, there's a departure of reality from a moment that final section of the movie begins, where Nicholas uncovers this great conspiracy, and it just gets more and more detached from reality to the point where we then have this massive shootout where everyone has guns hidden.
Everyone and their mum.
The school teacher has foam beds for her guns in a little picnic basket and
on a bicycle. Yeah. It all gets very silly, but the reason that all of these murders have happened, Nicholas Angel comes up with this theory about the money and this thing that makes sense of actually these people have been killed in order that money can be bought to stop a big outdoor supermarket.
Bypass. There's a bypass.
Yeah,
A bypass and a new development.
From happening, and he confronts them and say, I know this is why you've been doing these murders, it's because of this. And they're like, no, it's not because of this. We killed these first two actors because they were terrible actors. This bloke had an ugly house, and so we wanted to blow it up and get rid of it. We've got rid of hoodies.
Was a terrible reporter and got my age wrong.
Yeah. What is it? She's 54 and she's only 52 or something like that. No, it said
she was 55 and she's only 53.
There we go. And see, they would have got me for getting that wrong too. And it turns out actually all these murders have been done in order to protect the greater good.
The greater good.
That is this idyllic village. And so I thought we could talk a little bit about the greater good.
The greater good.
And what we think the greater good is. And is that something to aspire to or not?
Hoo boy.
Hoo boy. Machiavelli. Utilitarianism, the trolley problem. It's all on today.
Yeah. So, bringing in utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the moral concept that things should be done for the greatest good of the most. And so the guys here in the village are following a skewed version of that philosophy, that actually they're doing all these things for the greatest good of the village and the people there, but actually perhaps that isn't the greatest good.
Yes, they're calling it the greater good.
The greater good.
But it's all in the service of winning the Village of the Year competition in memory of the police chief's wife who passed away.
Yes.
And really for very petty reasons. So even down to the florist who was murdered because she was going to move away. And had been a member of the number. They said, if we can't have her, no one can. We can't let her take her fantastic skills to another village.
Yeah.
So they're claiming the greater selfish good.
The greater good.
And we talk about also some travellers who were the kind of kick-off for this, and they use a slur to describe them. And that very bigoted, very prejudiced language, and anyone who doesn't fit into their perfect village impression gets murdered, including those kids who were first arrested by Nick for underage drinking. In fact, it's revealed that one of the reasons that there's a very low crime rate is because instead of prosecuting anyone who has even a minor infraction, they get murdered instead.
Much more simple. Easier, less paperwork.
There's something that's just occurred to me as well. I mean, the first thing that occurred to me is somewhat obvious, in that the people who are members of the Neighbourhood Watch Alliance are all of an age, of a generation, and have been, they are local people. They have grown up there, and so there is sort of commentary there on age, generation,
social class,
social class as well. I think it's also worth just clocking that I can't think of any actor in that film who is not white. And victim or otherwise, and maybe in the background in London, the only ethnic minority you get reference to are the traveller community.
Yeah, but it's trying to represent that small rural village where there isn't that diversity in the same way. Not to defend it, and actually it would have been better with different actors, but it is that small white-mindedness challenged in this.
And even down to, though we talk about they're all local people, but not the super local. So even down to, on the Neighbourhood Watch Alliance, you've got one of the farmers, who is a more prosperous farmer, and maybe more gentleman farmer, versus we have in the movie one of the less well-off local farmers who speaks in such a strong accent that you have to go through a series of translation.
A double translation, yeah.
And that farmer is the one who gets murdered for the greater good.
The greater good.
And so you've got also those levels of socio-economic power and levels of value to the community.
Also, with all of this, we discover police corruption as well, in that Danny's dad, who is the boss, the chief constable, I can't remember the proper terms, he knows about all this and he's doing it because this is the best village and it needs protecting and looking after. But the rest of the coppers there don't understand all this. They've just become a bit complacent and haven't seen it in the same way and just got fooled by.
To be like that, though.
Yeah.
They have been trained to be complacent and not have any investigative desires. And anyone who does stick their head above the parapet gets murdered. So Sergeant before Nicholas Angel gets disposed of, and they try to dispose of Nicholas as well. Yeah.
And one of my favourite scenes actually is the supermarket scene where they all gather together in their riot gear to take on Skinner, and actually that banding together. And yes, they're still having those jokes and having a laugh about it. And one of the Andys thinks the other Andy's been injured, and he's like, "No, it's just bolognese." And them just gathering together and realising when they've done wrong and been complacent and actually fixing it and doing something different is,
And Nick as well really learns to relax a bit. And we see that right towards the end where we see them all in the station doing the paperwork and he's engaging in the banter as well. But what we also see is that there is a discussion in the movie of forms of greater good. And it's not as blatant as the initial greater good conversation, but we have this contrast between the Neighbourhood Watch Alliance's version of the greater good,
the greater good,
and Nicholas Angel's version of the greater good, the moral superiority of the police upholding the law. And I believe I watched an interview or a commentary with Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg where they were talking about the very final scene where Nicholas Angel is now in charge and he's zooming about in his police car and he's wearing leather gloves, and they're saying we're supposed to feel dis-ease at that ending where there's a sort of police state enforced, because the Nicholas Angel's response to, even in that penultimate shootout scene, is highly exaggerated and disproportionate.
I think there are kind of two things going on there. One is that throughout the movie there are references to other buddy cop movies. So there's an element of it spoofing those movies. But I take that there is also that other thing going on, which is kind of addressing and critiquing those movies, which kind of put these buddy cops who are full of righteousness or self-righteousness on a pedestal, and sometimes they're exacting justice through vigilantism or their own by their own means, and those movies justify them because we are seeing the world through their lens, and we are seeing the corruption or the villainy that they are bringing down. But there is still something about, okay, what is the cause that they are doing this in the name of? And does that fall under the greater good?
The greater good.
In
a different way, as you say.
Yeah, because Nicholas hasn't watched any of these, has he? And so Danny introduces him into all these different films. And at the end, Danny's like, "Oh, what did you think of it?" And Nicholas says, "Oh, there'd be a lot more paperwork and stuff like that." So he's trying to bring it back together. But that question of greater good and moral superiority and what's the best course of action is an interesting one. And I didn't pick up on that with him in his leather gloves at the end of the film. I thought actually they've worked it out and he's loosened up a bit, and so I didn't have that unease of him in a police state.
But there's there's that final call he gets where Doris comes across on the radio and says, "Oh, there's been some hippie types messing with the recycling bins at the supermarket."
Oh, right.
And that's what they kind of zoom off in the car to respond to. Like, which is... That feels a bit...
I'd not read it like that. But yeah, I can see why that definitely is a thing. And with the world today... Sorry, we're going to depress us for a moment of actually, there are lots of people who claim to be doing things for the greater good and do horrific things supposedly for the good of all and thinking of the greater good.
Well, actually, I think there is actually the phrase in the movie, "Make Sanford great again."
Oh, is there?
I'm almost certain, I'm 90% sure that "Make Sanford great again" is either on a sign around the whole award.
No way.
Yeah.
Now we see where Trump got it. He watched Hot Fuzz.
Obviously. And also there is, I mean, at the moment, there is a conversation around policing and what police are doing. And I think what we see in Hot Fuzz is Nicholas very rarely seems to be actually trying to solve the problems which are causing the crimes. So right at the beginning, we see him arresting some underage young men for drunken misbehaviour. And the sort of the thing is, but why? Like, yes, it's against the law, but all he seems to be interested in is making those arrests. There's no follow-up of why is there this problem in the community. And whereas we hear from the other side of the conversation, from the Neighbourhood Watch, saying, actually, letting these youngsters into the pub keeps them off the streets.
Yeah. There was a pub I used to go to where there would be quite a lot of underage folk in there. They wouldn't be drinking, and there always had to be someone who was 18 with them. But it enabled there to be a safe space for the more alternative young people, that actually they knew that this was a place where they could be and relax and not be judged or looked at because they looked a bit alternative in the kind of heavy metal punk, that kind of thing, queer in some way, some of them, and that this was a safe space. And so it wasn't like a blind eye was turned, because actually they were fine because they were there with an over 18-year-old. But it was also kind of going, you can come and hang out in the pub.
Yeah, it's that... I think what Nicholas Angel, and his perspective of what the greater good is it lacks a certain amount of nuance for the care of kind of what I would call community policing, which would actually be more about working with the community for the good of the community and tackling core issues, rather than reactive policing, which is I think what we see in the movie.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know enough about policing.
I would suspect that for somebody in Nicholas Angel's position, they wouldn't have the, their job description is not to reform society. And sure, they may be able to have all the ideas and see, okay, well, if we were to change that, that might change the reason why all of these things are happening. But the thing that that they are paid to do is to follow up crime and violence and that kind of thing. And it is interesting because you hear his backstory, and he and actually I think he talks about being given like a police car to
Yeah,
drive around in
that's
as a
what
child, and so from a very early age he's got a sense of justice and what is right and what is wrong, and that's all he ever wanted to be, kind of thing.
He talks about how that car had been bought by his uncle, and he discovered it was bought from drug dealing money.
Right.
And from that moment, he never touched that police car again. But he, from that point, had a very strong sense of what moral superiority was and right and wrong, and he was determined to uphold that particular view of morality.
Yeah. So bringing this to Jesus then, because we are vicars. And I think sometimes Christians are accused of having moral superiority, or seeming to have moral superiority. Yeah. As Christians, do we strive for the greater good?
The greater good. No.
Why?
I don't like the idea of the greater good, because I think it too easily becomes defined by a human's value, or human way of looking at the world. It becomes our way of determining who is greater, what is greater, and what we may sacrifice in order to keep that greater thing going. I'm much more in favour of thinking of Christianity as looking out for the common good. What is going to serve everybody, and if there is a cost to serving everybody, then that cost needs to be made by us and about us. And I mean, thinking about it on a super individual level, if we think about our vocation and our calling to priesthood, we are called to serve everybody, and that comes at the cost of how we might live our lives, what we might do with our lives otherwise if we weren't called to serve everybody, and we might call that the greater good about our own lives, because we're serving everybody else, and there is there's a greater purpose to living our lives this way. But that's not the same as sort of saying, well, I think we should change this, or we should get rid of those people, because if we just do that, then that's going to be for the greater good.
Yeah.
I don't know how articulate that is.
No, I'm going to keep going with this. So I really like the differentiation between the greater good and the common good. I think with the greater good, we're in that philosophical space with Machiavelli, where the ends justify the means, and it doesn't matter what you do to achieve the means. But also the trolley problem, which, if you're unfamiliar with a trolley problem, it's asking a question of, there's a train coming down the tracks and you've got a track changer. As it currently stands, the train is on a track where it's going to collide with a group of people. If you change your track, there's one person on the other track. And you've got to decide, would you pull that lever? That's the trolley
Have you seen the video of the kid doing that? There's a video where a dad has created it with Duplo, and he's like, which track should they go down? And the kid picks up the one and places it with the other, and you think, oh, great, he's cleared the track. And then he ploughs through all of them.
Yeah. So that's a greater good, where the needs
Destroy
of the
all
many,
humanity.
Yeah, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of a few. The common good is grounded, at least in Christianity, in agape. That's a type of love that Jesus talks about. It's one of the many Greek words for love. And agape is a sacrificial love. It's the love which Jesus demonstrates on the cross, but also in his teaching, where he talks about putting the needs of others above yourself. And also prioritizing the needs of the most vulnerable. It's a love grounded in compassion for the other and compassion for those who are suffering, which is different to needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few in some respects. Would you agree?
I suppose I mean, maybe it is the greater good at the end of the day, to some extent, but what we see through scripture is the flip reversal of what usually happens when people talk about the greater good. If we take the Magnificat, Mary's song at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, the greater good is bringing the mighty down from their thrones and lifting up the lowly, filling up those who are hungry and sending the rich away empty. Maybe there's something about thinking about what the agenda is with regards to the common good and the greater good.
The sort of the principles of Christ, which are mercy and hope and forgiveness and liberation.
I think there's something I've got going around in my head, the life of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, the death of Jesus upon the cross, and how that came to be. And in many ways, you could possibly look at the justification of the teachers of the law and the scribes, possibly Judas as well, Pontius Pilate. They are looking at the greater good of maintaining good relationships with oppressors, with maintaining the peace. And they think, well, we can kill this guy for the greater good of maintaining peace in this, as we oppress these people, as we try to negotiate with our oppressors. I'm not going to cast. I'm not going to step into that moral superiority kind of role and sort of condemn them. Because the political situation then must have been really complicated and scary. But what we do see in Jesus is something different in the way that he responds, in which he practices justice and compassion. He's not apathetic. He has a point of view, but he's not looking to fight or assassinate. He condemns Peter for striking the ear off Malchus, the servant.
And Jesus as well, he challenges anyone who assumes a sense of moral superiority, whether that's the opposing religious figures or his disciples. And he says, whatever you're doing must be grounded in love. There is no moral superiority without love. There is no moral action without love. And every facet of the law, if the law is your moral superiority, must be interpreted through the lens of love. So for Jesus, the greater good is when you are making a decision, you must consider agape, love, sacrificial love.
I'm a very practical person in all of this, and lots of this thinking has kind of been, let's suppose this, hypothesize. That's the word. And I wondered about us practically, as priests, as vicars, as Christians, how do we show and work out that common good in our lives, in our roles, in the stuff that we do?
Okay, so I've got an example of what we shouldn't aspire to. Here is a case study. I'm not going to name any names or any churches, but there are certain churches.
You can look at Kate's career on Crockford's.
There are certain churches that like to present an idea of we are the perfect Christian family, and there is no dissent in our ranks. we are all devout Christians, devout followers of Jesus, and we're all living perfectly devout lives. And one of the ways they maintain that is by excommunicating any dissenters, essentially. If you are a dissenting voice against the teaching, against the culture, if you're questioning, or if you represent something that doesn't fit into the worldview of that church, you are cast out. Either directly, you're told not to come back, or you're just gradually iced out. You know, you're not invited
on the rota
along. You're not on the rota anymore. You're not invited along to socials. You're not made to feel welcome, and then you stop going. So, like, that is a version of some churches which exist. And I know, at least I've encountered some of those churches. I know you will have as well. The alternative to that is saying, actually, in church, we are not perfect people. And there will be dissent. There will be imperfect behaviour. There will be things that are messy. But within that, we are working towards the good of each other and the good of our communities.
Yeah, but I want to avoid it being the total opposite, because I think then there's forms of control as well.
Yeah, there
that
are.
if we have these groups where, you know, everyone is a terrible, terrible sinner and awful and banded together around that, there can be so much coercive control from that.
Yeah.
And yes, I think it is much more towards that end. It's more like, you know, we're a group of broken people who've got problems, but we've also got really great stuff about us as well. And it's been that kind of family in a non-culty way, because that could be used as a weapon as well of actually being broken, messed up people who are not perfect but aren't superior and all of this stuff. Actually, that's a really important thing, that we recognize our brokenness and try our best to be the best we can with it.
Similarly, it's really important in terms of accountability, whistleblowing, and safeguarding. Often in church communities where somebody may have been accused or caught as an abuser, a community will find themselves saying, "But aren't we supposed to forgive people?" And actually. Yes, but forgiveness is not a simple whitewash of toxic, abusive behaviour. And when we sin, when we hurt people and abuse people, there need to be consequences to that.
Justice.
And justice. It is not good news. It is not gospel to say to someone who is being abused, don't you think you should just forgive them? Because then we can get back to how great Sanford is. The greater
good.
The greater good, absolutely. And so it's really important that as a church, we are able to speak out against corruption and abuse within our communities.
So one thing I think is a sign of a really healthy church, or to be honest, a really healthy community, is when dissenting voices are allowed to be part of the discussion and they're not silenced. I think it's a really powerful thing to bring someone who disagrees with what you're doing, particularly in churches, to have a space at the table and not be silenced. And this will be painful for everyone. It is painful as a vicar, as a church leader, for someone to say to you, I disagree, I don't think you're using the time well, I don't think the direction of the church is going well, I think we should be doing X instead. But it is important to include that and allow the space for the pain, but in a helpful and productive way, rather than letting it malinger.
I agree mostly. Maybe I'm far more of a dictator than you are, Kate. But actually, I think there are those spaces for dissenting voices, and that's important. But I think that's important to be in controlled environments.
Yeah.
Like, if someone during a service just started mouthing off about me and that I was doing everything wrong and stuff like that, that is not an appropriate and helpful thing. And if it's someone who's just got hold of one thing and just keeps badgering on about it, even if after you've made a decision that's different, there needs to be a time to just go, we're not doing that, and that's enough.
Yeah, so there is the appropriate inclusion of dissenting voices, and also there does have to become a point where sometimes you say, look, we just cannot continue on together because there is no reconciliation here. And, you know, there are times where you have to let people go. Or, you know, what we don't want is for either party to become bullied into compliance. So from, you don't want to bully the dissenting voice into compliance, but you also don't want everyone else to be bullied into compliance, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And I know that we're focusing on parish level, but part of me is also scaling that up to denominational level, and we're in the context where schism within the Church of England is potentially is either happening or has happened or is very much on the cards, and so there is that context at that level as well in terms of dissenting voices, and what does church unity mean?
You reach a point where at some point you have to say, this is where we're going forward, and that ideally your path forward is the one which is the path of I would say, if we're looking at the greater good, it's the path of compassion and common good, rather than privilege. And I don't know. It's so hard. It is.
Yeah.
Well, I think the deeper we get into reflecting, the more we start questioning ourselves. Are we? What are we doing? It's like with Hot Fuzz. On an initial surface, Nick Angel, he has the right of it. He is challenging corruption, and he is fighting essentially for the freedom of the people of this village to not be murdered if they put a step wrong. But, as I've said, the more you reflect on him, is his version of moral superiority actually something we want to subscribe to, or does he take it too far in another direction? And when we're looking at our jobs and parish level, but also then higher, the more we self-examine, the more complicated it begins. But I think maybe what's important is that we do self-examine, and we do challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, what are our biases? What are the things we're taking for granted or taking for read? And what are our reasons for doing what we do?
And recognising that we're not always going to get it right either. There'll be times that we mess up and we make the wrong call, and being willing to hold our hands up and go, yep, that wasn't the right thing to do. Let's move on.
But I think in terms of that conversation around moral superiority, certainly it was something that I had as a Christian up until, well, I probably still have it on a subconscious level, or less than conscious level, or whatever. But certainly at university, I remember, a very strong moment in my third year where I had never smoked a cigarette, and I was with a friend of mine who smoked, and there was a part of me that held that as a kind of high horse. I was on this high horse because I had never smoked, and that was attached to my Christian identity for sure, because I followed what I perceived to be a good Christian life and didn't smoke. And I asked my friend whether I could have a drag, and actually that did a lot of good for me, because all of a sudden I didn't have this. I had no longer had this high horse that I had inherited or made up in my head, giving me moral superiority. And I think there are two ways in which a lot of Christians can react to the sense of moral superiority that they receive. One is either, as we've said, that self-reflection, which breaks down those identity markers of, well, I'm living a good life because I follow the letter of Scripture as according to my tradition, or whatever. Or it is to really dig your heels in and say, well, I am morally superior because of that. And you change your world around you and you drive other people away because they're not living a life as good as you are. And I think that's where we find two different voices within our churches, sometimes at a parish level, sometimes at a much bigger level. Those who are going to dig their heels in, look inward and say, we're doing it right because da-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. And those who keep an awareness of the whole complexity and let go of superiority.
Yeah, and actually if we go to the Bible, then a lot of Paul's letters to the early churches were all about what we've been talking about, and a sense of who some of you in your church feel like you have a moral superiority here, and you are policing behaviour in a certain way. But what Paul says, and I'm thinking particularly of Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 13, is actually you should be acting out of love and care for the other. So Romans 8, Paul is essentially saying that if you think you've got a moral high ground here, you need to focus more on the needs of the other person, because if what you're doing is a stumbling block in faith for someone else, that's not on. But then in 1 Corinthians 13, which we often have at weddings, love is patient, love is kind, yada yada yada, it begins with Paul saying, if I speak in the tongues of angels but have not love, I am nothing. And if I do great deeds but have not love, then I'm nothing. And essentially saying, no matter what you're doing, it all needs to be grounded. The whole conversation of moral superiority actually needs to be grounded in love and compassion for the other.
It's all about the love, baby.
I was chatting to someone recently about how in many ways Scripture and the Christian life isn't about morality. It's much more about how you live a good spiritual life. And that will then have an impact on morality and the questions around what it means to live in community. Bring about ideas of morality and what is good. But there is also something about those situations where maybe there is no good or there is no right. The trolley problem is always going to be, someone is always going to die, either the one person or the many. And for anybody who is in a position like that, actually having a healthy spiritual life is going to hold them better in whatever decision ends up being made.
It reminds me of I think it was a GCSE RE or A-level RE, and a conversation not about the greater good but the lesser evil. What causes the least harm, recognizing that what you're doing is still causing harm, whereas the greater good sort of denies that harm is being caused or lessens the recognition of that.
And perhaps there is something in bringing it back to Jesus and playing around with atonement theology and the theology of the cross, whether there is something about the least evil is God coming into the world and sacrificing
to do the greatest good.
himself to do the greatest good via the least evil, which is also in some ways the worst evil, by some humans who commit torture and execution of an innocent person. But from that godly perspective, that divine perspective, it is the least evil, because God is surrendering God's self to redeem, to love, to save the world, not to condemn it.
Yes. And this is what we're called to model. In our gospel just this Sunday, we had Jesus saying, take up your cross and follow me, deny yourself. And I think it's words for us to meditate on. And I think when it comes to this discussion of moral decision-making, moral superiority, I think it should never be easy. Because to take up the cross is to take on a burden. And even Jesus, the night before he was crucified, was overcome with turmoil and struggled with what he had to do in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think if we then bring it all back to this idea of a perfect community, that Hot Fuzz, the Neighbourhood Watch Alliance, are trying to curate. In the narrative of salvation, we recognise that there is no perfect community on Earth. If things were perfect in Eden in the narrative, things became imperfect, and the perfect will not return until we see a new heaven and a new earth.
So there is no making the Church of England great again.
Indeed. There is no... It is something we should strive for, but recognition that even in our striving we are imperfect. There we go. I think we've gotten quite heavy with that conversation.
Yeah, I want a cornetto now.
So, let's all decompress. Let's all decompress. Dear listeners, please look after yourselves. That was a very heavy thing to think about. Go out, touch grass, spend time in the sunshine. If it's raining, enjoy the rain. Enjoy comedy movies as comedies without overanalyzing them, as we just have.
Yeah.
And dear listeners, as we finish today,
we hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Vicars Watch Dibley. Thank you to Nat for editing our ramblings.
Any opinions expressed are our own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Church of England or any other organisation with which we are affiliated.
If you like our podcast, leave us a review, follow us on social media and share it with your friends. And, as always, bless you for listening.
Okay, so a police officer pulls over a priest who's driving erratically.
Ugh.
And immediately smells alcohol on the breath of the priest. The next thing the police officer notices is an empty wine bottle on the passenger seat. And the officer says, "Have you been drinking, Father?" "Just water," says the priest. "Then why do I smell wine?" says the police officer. The priest looks at the bottle and says, "Good Lord, he's done it again."
Oh, that's a good one.